So we're going to talk about one of the most important aspects of corneal refractive surgery, which is the screening for keratoconus. And, what we're taught in residency, of course, is that keratoconus is diagnosed with a number of these signs, Vogt striae, etc. But these are all signs that normally appear on corneas that would have been completely easily detected by topography. And the trick in refractive surgery, of course, is to spot an incipient, very, very early cone before taking tissue out of it and weakening the cornea further and producing, an accelerated ectasia situation. So in the 1990s, computerized analysis of placido ring systems were introduced on several devices. And Rabinovitz did a major piece of work in looking at the different shapes of these topographies and classifying them into bins. The classic appearance of keratoconus was, associated much more with the highlighted here, the red highlighted pictures, the inferior steepening being the most common, but asymmetric bow tie or skewed axes, asymmetric skewed axes, or this crab claw appearance, butterfly or vertical D. These were the images that would imply that there might be a case of keratoconus. And between experts, it was one of these, oh, well, in my experience, John, I think, this, and what do you think, Jack? And it was all very opinion-based. Like I said, the standard barn door keratoconus on topography is the inferior steepening picture. But some of us started using a device called the Orb Scan, which was a tomographic device that enabled us to get the back surface shape as well. And I was privy to having one of these machines in my fellowship in 1996, 97. We early on started to notice that it was possible to have a completely normal front surface with what looked like a rather abnormal back surface, and that it was the more obvious keratoconic cases that had both front and back surface changes. So this, by the way, is something which sounds obvious right now, but I can tell you that even up into the late 2000s, it was still being debated as to whether keratoconus shows up first on the back surface. Of course, now there's no debate about it, but even amongst experts, this was going on. And, here's an example of what looks like a curvature map, a sagittal map that looks completely normal, although it may be a little bumpy down here. And that's the elevation of the front surface. And here's your thickness map. And here's your back surface elevation. And you can see that the back surface elevation has this saddle appearance, which is exaggerated compared to the saddle appearance of the front surface. So this is something which, might be a little suspicious. If we look at, it might be suspicious, but it's technically classified as normal. But if we look at a situation here where the back surface is, the elevation from the best fit sphere is really quite pronounced, and much more so than the elevation from the front surface, here you can imagine a situation where there's extrusion or ectasia of the back surface, but not of the front surface. And in fact, the axial power map only has a slight asymmetry inferiorly. If that was looked at alone, it might be classified as normal. So using back surface information gets us to the point of being able to detect keratoconus a little bit more early, even in the presence of what looks like a normal axial power map of the front surface. Now, in barn door or, obvious keratoconus, you have a situation where there's inferior steepening and there's elevation of the front surface eccentrically, and there's back surface elevation eccentrically, and all of these are coincident with the thinning of the cornea in the same location. And it is the coincidence of all these suspect elements that then leads to the diagnosis of keratoconus. Now, Michael Bellin from upstate New York had a brilliant idea. He said, well, these best fit spheres are taking into account the central cone is pulling the sphere up, but most of the cornea is still relatively normal. So is there a way that we can accentuate the elevation of the back surface if it's abnormal in a specific zone? So what he said was, let's take the thinnest point of the cornea and let's draw a border form in the 4 millimeter zone, so 2 millimeter radius, and let's exclude that area from the best fit sphere. So we're going to do the best fit sphere of the cornea minus the central thinnest part. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plot the elevation above that best fit sphere. And what that does is that it accentuates any small cone. And on the Bellin display, you have the elevation of the back surface relative to, excluding that 4 millimeter zone, and the back surface, the front surface, the back surface, and the difference between the two. Here is without exclusion. So you see, without exclusion, you don't really see a bump. With exclusion, the bump is plotted a little bit, considerably higher than it would have been if you'd included the best fit sphere of the whole surface. And he set some parameters to say, well, this is almost certainly normal, this is questionable, and this is almost certainly not normal. Renato Ambrosio, who was a fellow of his at the time, came up with a second suggestion, which said, I think he was a fellow of his anyway, I might be wrong there. He said, look, let's look at thickness progression. And, obviously, if a cornea is thinner in the center than expected for the given peripheral thickness, then that rate of change of curvature is going to be different. Rate of change of thickness is going to be different. And he suggested that we include rate of change of elements. And there's a series of these. You can look at the manual for the details. But combining these elements gives you big D. And the big D is a determinant of the risk of this cornea being keratoconic. So obviously in this case, there's extrusion of the front surface and the back surface. The difference between the two is huge, and the big D is red and very, very large. Now, you can have cases where, the elements of this and of course, we use topography and back surface analysis to look at the progression of keratoconus over time. But what we're really interested in refractive surgery clinics is finding the needle in the haystack. And the sensitivity of a back surface elevation in the absence of front surface changes is hampered by the inaccuracy of the determination of the shape of the back surface. Right? So if you've got a slit of light going through the cornea, you're calculating the position of the back surface through cornea from your imaging system. There are inaccuracies inherent based on the refractive index changes. And so this limits our ability to pick up what might be an abnormal back surface because it might be just noise, right? It might just be. And so here's where my contribution came in. So as some of you may know from looking me up, I was the first to measure epithelial thickness in the human cornea in vivo in 1991 when I came to do my research fellowship with Jack Coleman and Ron Silverman at Cornell University. And that was 1991. And I started my residency in 93. So this was a couple of years before I'd even done ophthalmology. And I realized using these high frequency ultrasound transducers that we were able to measure and resolve and measure the epithelium. And I was very lucky because no one around me thought that was of any use or of any purpose or had any implications. And if you're a young budding ophthalmologist listening to this talk, you should understand what I mean by that. If you find something as a resident or as a pre-resident that your professors think is of no use, you have an opportunity here to say, well, let me look into this, because if I find something of use, then I'm a first, right? So I concentrated my career in the first few years on the measurement of the epithelium of the cornea. And I was the first to publish, what the thickness was in vivo and with high accuracy. And I was the first to make a three-dimensional display of the epithelium. And wind the clock forward many, many years later, I characterized in a large series of patients the profile of the epithelium of the normal cornea. This is the average profile. And I found that, yes, the center of the epithelium was about 50 microns, but all the textbooks at the time said that there was 50 microns everywhere. And what we found was that, in fact, it was only 50 microns in the center, and that there was a superior to inferior difference of about 6 microns, and there was a nasal to temporal difference of about a micron. And is this relevant? Well, I'm going to show you why. We were able to measure the epithelium with 1 micron precision. So we were able to very, very sensitively describe this profile. The other thing that we learned was that there was mirror symmetry to this epithelial profile. And then that leads you to try and understand why. And if we think about the anatomy and we think about the eyelid, and we think about the fact that the eyelid contains a semi-rigid tarsus and that the semi-rigid tarsus has a particular shape, and you can understand that this particular template is abutting against the epithelium and providing a template, a shape template, and you're blinking 10,000 times a day and sleeping with your eyelid on there, and that is shaping the outer surface of the epithelium, which of course then shapes the refraction of the eye, because the most important refractive surface is the surface of the epithelium, covered in tear film. So understanding the natural shape of the epithelium was one thing, but then looking at how the epithelium changed in different situations led me to understand that looking at epithelial profiles may be an even better way of screening for keratoconus than had been used. And I first proposed this in about 2004. It went through all the stages of Schopenhauer's stages of all truths passed through 3 stages. First, ignored. Second, violently opposed. And third, as accepted as inherently obvious. And I'm lecturing to you now, your residents and fellows, and you're hearing about this now. I still have colleagues who aren't quite convinced about epithelial thickness profile screening. But let me go through the theory as I presented it back then. So essentially, you'll have you have a cornea with a front surface, a stromal surface, and a back surface. Okay, and the epithelium obviously fills that gap between the front of the epithelium and the front of the stroma. Now, in keratoconus, you have bulging of the front and back surface, and we have a reactive thinning of the epithelium over the bulge, trying to compensate for that irregularity. And so you end up with a thin area surrounded by a thicker area of epithelium, you see. Now, in the case of very early keratoconus, where the back surfaces only just started to become ectatic, the epithelium will completely absorb whatever change on the front surface of the stroma is present. There's an early stage of keratoconus of ectasia process where the epithelium can absorb all of that epithelial shift, and you end up with a completely normal front surface, but with a very slightly abnormal back surface. And I'm going back to what I said earlier, the abnormality of the back surface might be so tiny that it gets lost in the soup of what is the noise of the back surface measurement, particularly on devices such as the Pentacam that have a particularly inaccurate representation of the posterior surface. So this epithelium can hide the stromal surface cone. And so it's the coincidence of finding a slightly abnormal back surface, eccentric elevation of the back surface, with an overlying thinning of the epithelium that alerts you to this probably being an early cone. And I talked about this for several years as a way of avoiding ectasia and what looked like a normal cornea. I didn't get a lot of traction in the meetings, and I'm telling you the God-honest truth here. A few years later, I flipped the argument the other way around. And I said, well, the most interesting thing about this could be that you can have situations where the epithelium is actually quite thick inferiorly. And this produces inferior steepening. And I've seen lots of cases where it looks like a keratoconic eye, but by doing an epithelial map, you prove that it's not a keratoconic eye, because you can't have thick epithelium over an extrusion of the front anterior surface. And this raised eyebrows, because in a study that we did, we showed that out of 1,500 eyes, about 10% were suspect. We did epithelial maps on those with high-frequency ultrasound and found that in 84% of the cases, the corneas were deemed to be normal, and we did LASIK on them. So the argument now became you need an epithelial map to rule a cornea in for surgery, as opposed to just trying to find these needle in the haystacks where the front surface is normal and the back surface is not. So avoiding a complication isn't what sold the epithelium, if you like. What sold the epithelium to the industry was the fact that you could do more surgery by excluding keratoconus. It's an interesting story from a marketing standpoint. Anyhow, we had characterized that in keratoconus, the more severe the keratoconus, the thinner the epithelium was over the thinnest point, and the thicker the epithelium was around the donut part of the epithelial profile, around that cone. So exploiting these differences between the normal and the abnormal became our paper on using epithelial profiles to diagnose keratoconus at the earliest stage. And obviously, if you're looking at barn door keratoconus, there's an obvious difference, but you might be looking at very subtle differences. And for that matter, Ron Silverman and myself, we applied for an R01 grant from the NIH. We got a couple of $1 million. We spent a few years doing a study where we found a machine algorithm that we could use that, we started off with 160 variables, ended up with just a 6-variable model. But with those 6 variables and those coefficients, we were able, with incredible specificity, able to say whether this was or wasn't keratoconus. And we had an incredibly high sensitivity at picking up keratoconus, even if it was very, very mild. And so this sensitivity and specificity was unprecedented. I mean, it's still unprecedented. There's no tomographic method that has that level of sensitivity or specificity. And why is epithelium more sensitive at picking up epithelium than tomography? Well, because tomographic changes that are detecting curvature changes need to, the signal to noise ratio of an abnormality versus background noise is going to be a few microns, let's say. Whereas because we can measure the epithelium with 1 micron precision, even a micron of abnormal focal inferior thinning, which obviously shouldn't be there, even a micron can, seriously, up the suspicion of detecting an early keratoconus. So here's some examples. Here's a completely normal topography in a slightly hyperopic eye, again, unlikely to have keratoconus, in an eye that has best spectacle corrected vision of 20/12, which is unlikely to have keratoconus, in a flat cornea, which is incredibly unlikely to have keratoconus, in a 37-year-old in whom you'd expected the keratoconus to have already progressed. So basically normal. And the topography algorithm says this is normal. And most people would just go straight and do LASIK on a patient like this. We look at the Bell and Ambrosio plot. There was maybe 1 yellow box, but everything else white, and the D was completely white. It was a 0.61. It was a very normal D. But when we look at the epithelial profile, we see highly abnormal profile. This is a dramatic case, right? You've got a donut of epithelium, quite obviously. And that donut is, represented here as this is a pattern deviation map. So this is the difference between that patient's epithelium and the normal population. And you can see that it's got inferior thinning relative to the normal population. And that abnormality is placed right over where the back surface is ever so slightly abnormal, something that is not picked up as being abnormal by the Bell and Ambrosio enhanced ectasia algorithm. And certainly that epithelial profile is generating a completely normal front surface. So this is exactly the sort of case that would slip under the radar, have LASIK, and end up with progressive ectasia down the road, even though there are 50 reasons why it would have been argued it wasn't keratoconus. The algorithm, the automated algorithm that the RSK, as we call it, Reinstein-Silverman keratoconus parameter, was deeply keratoconic. And so, here's where I'm showing in one slide one example, but this is where we really are able to detect keratoconus far earlier with looking at epithelial maps than looking at topography. And so if you were going to go off to a desert island with an excimer laser and you only relied on one device, the one that you would choose would be an epithelial thickness map as opposed to a topography map if you're looking to spot the earliest keratoconics. And so this is a very old slide from the old days when I was trying to make this argument and I was still fighting it. But you can have absolutely normal looking topographies with donut shapes underneath of epithelium and therefore false negatives. You can have abnormal front surfaces which get classified by a computer algorithm as being suspect keratoconus. Very hard to do surgery on an eye where the chart has a red suspect keratoconus written on it. But if you have an epithelial thickness map, you can prove that that inferior steepening is due to thickening of the epithelium, and you can classify these as normal, and of course then have more candidates for refractive surgery. So I presented this, like about 2008, 2009. And from that moment, one company that was very advanced in OCT started to develop their anterior segment OCT to be able to also resolve the epithelium. And now there are a number of companies on the market. In the US, you only have the original company, Optoview, with the Avanti, and Zeiss with the Cirrus 5000 with a special lens to do anterior segment scanning. But in Europe, we have the CSO MS39. I believe this is coming your way in the US soon. We're in 2021 here, crossing the border into 2021, hopefully this year or next year. I'll come to why that is just such a great help to the world. But of course, remember that all of this work was done with high-frequency ultrasound originally, and we started with rather scary-looking prototypes, but eventually a company called Orb Scan licensed all the patents from Cornell and a lot of the expertise that we developed over the years on reverse water bath and scanning technology. This machine will come up when I talk to you about ICL sizing, because there's an application looking at posterior chamber dimensions which cannot be achieved with any other device. It has to be done with high-frequency ultrasound. But with respect to epithelial thickness measurements, we now do our basic screening with OCT, and in about 1 in 10 patients where we're still not sure because of the slightly less accurate epithelial map on OCT, we then move on to ultrasound scans for the definitive answers. And so this has been approved now for several years worldwide. So as you can see, the evolution of keratoconus screening has gone from just looking at the front surface to incorporating the back surface to then actually really correlating all of this to the epithelial thickness profile. And, that is the state of the art in terms of detecting keratoconus, is having an epithelial map. So doing refractive surgery today without an epithelial map could be considered medical legally rather treacherous, because the physical availability of epithelial maps on the market for the last 5-6 years now. It's not research tools. These are now commercially available devices, and even in the United States, which is obviously behind the rest of the world in approvals. But even in the U.S., it would be hard to argue if you generated an ectasia and you hadn't done an epithelial map, if there was any abnormality whatsoever on the tomography or tomography, you'd have a hard time justifying that you were practicing at the right standard. So, the concept of not judging keratoconus just from the surface, I think I've hammered that pretty severely. And, let me just finish with this slide, which came from the late 90s when I was devising clinical protocols for keratoconus screening. And the fact is that there's a myriad of elements that you want to take into account when you're screening for keratoconus. It's not just epithelial maps or back surface or front surface. It's all of these things on this slide, and particularly ethnicity carries a big weight. As you know, Latin Americans, Asians, Southeast Asians, Indians, Middle Eastern ethnic groups, they are much more likely to have ectasia, keratoconus, endogenous ectasia, keratoconus, and we're looking at biomechanics of the cornea. So it's a multimodal decision. There's no one technology, or there's no one single test that is litmus test, if you like, for keratoconus. We still have to use a broad understanding of all of the different kinds of risk factors for keratoconus in order to avoid operating on a patient unwittingly, causing a problem. So what's the future? I mentioned this earlier. The future is currently the MS-39 from an Italian company called CSO that's been in topography for 30 years, and they are really at the forefront. And as you can see, normally at a slit lamp you have the keratometer next to your slit lamp, right? This I now call the slit lamp of the 20th century, and this one I call my slit lamp of the 21st century, because I'm able to get very high resolution scans through air very instantaneously, quite quickly, quite easily in my clinic. Here I am sitting at my desk at my slit lamp, and these measurements include epithelium. So whereas before I would have to use my atlas to get my front surface, my pentacam or my orb scan to get the back surface, and my Artemis Insight 100 to get my epithelium. And between these three, I would do the magic analysis and decide whether a patient was normal or not. Now, all of these maps are available instantaneously, and they are all acquired simultaneously, and they are all acquired with the same registration, right? So that every layer is registered to the other, whereas before it was 3 different tests, and I had to make assumptions about the registration between the images. So the coincidence of these 3 elements in one device with a scan that gets taken in a matter of a second is really state of the art in refractive surgery. And like I said, we're in 2021 recording this talk here. Hopefully within the next year or 2, this device will be available in the States, and I have absolutely no doubt that no other company is going to be able to survive without following the lead of CSO and having anterior segment OCT coupled with Posito front surfaces and essentially the technology that they've developed. So here again, looking at kind of historically at the different elements that can be devised from each of these companies that were making topography and tomography machines. RTView that pushed forward, and obviously I measured the epithelium first with ultrasound. RTView forged forward with an OCT, which is a lot more convenient to use, clearly. And that gives you the accessibility of screening every single patient who comes through the door for an epithelial map. And finally, CSO making it possible to do all of this in one device with one scan. I have no financial interest in the MS-39, but I wish I did. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that gives you an insight into the world perspective of keratoconus screening.